Bartók was very much a musician's musician. If he wasn't collecting folk song, he was teaching, or he was performing, or he was composing his works. He wasn't someone involved in writing long social tracts or essays. But Bartók was fascinated by what other composers of his generation were doing. And so we hear the influences of them in many of his works, but also hear his answers to them. When writing his pantomime, The Miraculous Mandarin, Bartók carried around with him a score of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, and he clearly worshipped the Russians' ingenuity. It's a pity that that worship wasn't quite so much returned by Stravinsky, who on Bartók's death commented that he never quite appreciated Bartók's gusto for folk music.
Stravinsky was a great influence in Bartók's life, of course, and Stravinsky was also using folk material, but he was lying about it, whereas Bartók was completely open about it. And if you think of The Rite of Spring, for instance, most of its thematic and motivic material is from Baltic folk songs. Somebody gave him a Lithuanian folk song book, and he just lifted a lot of that stuff straight out of the book. But being Stravinsky, he kept quiet about it. Well, they had a very different PR approach. Bartók was very, very shy, didn't enjoy the limelight. He's still a slightly shadowy figure for us, whereas Stravinsky, everything was documented, and he, wherever he went, he wanted to be with the hippest crowd, and he was dating the hippest of the hip, and he chose his circles extremely well to kind of, first of all, achieve notoriety, but also keep it going throughout his life. So he was a celebrity, and Bartók most certainly wasn't. And that's a huge difference.
So, was Bartók a figure of artistic principle or of artistic compromise? Some have seen him as being a third way between the more unbending Schoenberg and the more promotional Stravinsky. Yet again, some would see his final works as having been works of compromise, of pandering to the interests in popularity or of tunefulness, works such as the Concerto for Orchestra or the Third Piano Concerto. Indeed, his own country, Hungary, after his death, banned various of the uncompromising works of the 19-teens and 1920s, such as The Miraculous Mandarin or the First Piano Concerto. So, what do you hear in Bartók? Do you hear a figure of principle or one of compromise? One of Bartók's closest associates was the composer, folk music collector and teacher Zoltán Kodály. Bartók and Kodály collected and analysed folk music together over a period of some 30 years. Although Bartók and Kodály were interested in collecting folk music, Kodály stuck more closely to Hungarian-originated music, while Bartók ranged very widely across Eastern Europe and several other parts of the world. It's important to remember that you had many great composers in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in its final 30 or 40 years. You had, for instance, Schoenberg at the Viennese end, and you had Bartók at the Budapest end. People sometimes ask, well, did they know of each other? And yes, they certainly did. Even before the First World War, both were writing about each other. When writing his second violin concerto in the late 1930s, Bartók decided to play a joke. He wrote a 12-tone theme that went like this. Yehudi Menuhin tells the story of how Bartók saw this as being an attempt to out-Schoenberg Schoenberg, to show that you could write all sorts of different variations on 12-tone themes, as Schoenberg had done, but write them in a way that was indeed very pleasant. And my favourite of all coming, well, 20 minutes after those ones you've heard in the final movement of this concerto. In his opera, Duke Bluebeard's Castle, Bartók was keen to delineate the characters, as Debussy had done in his opera, Pelléas, but also to reflect the natural rhythms of speech, as Debussy had done. So we find here, firstly, an example of Judith, her curious character. She's keen to get on, to open the other doors. She's insistent. And the more stolid, the more laconic nature of Duke Bluebeard.
You can trace the lineage of Bluebeard into the symbolist movement, to Maurice Maeterlinck, whose Pelléas and Mélisande Debussy composed a couple of decades earlier. And the texts have a lot in common. The kind of dream landscape where we don't know what is what. But that's also characteristic of the symbolist style, that it's ultimately left up to us.
Even today, Béla Bartók, the young lad from Mod Sentmiklos, is hard to classify, is hard to place historically. He was not like Schoenberg, who founded his own school. He was not like Stravinsky, who became his own promotional enterprise. But Bartók is much, much more than a mere folk music composer or nationalist composer. Well, perhaps he's just Bartók.